So I've been shooting on Sony mirrorless cameras since the little NEX5. I've shot on the FS100, FS700, even the FS5. I've also shot on A7S, A7R, but more recently the little 6300 has become my little go-to camera for corporate doco work. I often need to travel quite light. I need to get stuff into a bag that size that goes on an aeroplane, can sit underneath my seat. So I've kind of worked around building a system that works for me within those small environments, and I thought I'd share some of that with you guys today. So core to any of my rigging work is a cage. I started out using the original A6000 cage made by Small Rig. In recent times, Small Rig have updated that cage with a few little refinements. A lot of that has come from users' input. There was a couple of things that I wanted on the original cage, and I fed that back into Small Rig. And they've then accommodated by adding some of the bits and pieces. So let's have a look at the differences. The first cage had minimal mounting points on the side. It didn't wrap all the way around to the battery end, so this piece there's a bit of flex on that, which is not necessarily ideal. There was no way of mounting a metabone support. The original HDMI grip, while really functional and can tighten up really nice and tight, I found that it always stuck in my nose whenever I was using the camera. If I was using the viewfinder, and it would stick in, that kind of shoves in your nose. Not really ideal. So let's have a look at some of the refinement on the new one. So the new one, they've added mounting points for their metabone support. So there's 2 points at the bottom here. There's a much larger area on the side for mounting things, as well as 1/4 and 3/8 mounting points. It's all chamfered edges, so it's a lot more comfortable to hold as well. They put a little cold shoe on top. There's loads of little mounting points at the top. The sides are very similar to the original. What they've also added is a little mounting point at the front here. So this mounting point allows you to mount things like little rods to the front. So you can take that rod. Small Rig make a couple of different sizes. So they make a 1 inch, 1.5 and a 2 inch. So you can mount a rod on the front. And one of the things I use it for is mounting a wireless follow focus when I'm using the DJI Ronin. Small Rig also developed a new HDMI clamp. So this clamp is a lot simpler. It doesn't stick out the back and poke in your face. It also clears space for the microphone. Bolts on the side. A little bit more fiddly to install, but it works and it's nice and neat and tidy. Very useful little clamp. Right, so now we've looked at the differences. Let's have a look at the camera mounted in the cage. Really, really simple. Drop straight in. Screws into the bottom. Always good. Make sure it's flush to the front of the cage. What happens is these front parts here are really good at helping dissipate heat. This A6300 does suffer in some conditions of overheating. And so these little front panels, if they're pressed up against the front, it helps dissipate the heat into the cage. So we'll just tighten that in. Right, so as you can see, quite comfortable to hold. You can get access to all of the controls. Really nice and neat and tidy. So Small Rig also make this little tripod plate. Now I used a lot of Manfrotto tripods, Manfrotto and Sachler tripods. These plates are interchangeable between the two systems. All of my cameras have Manfrotto tripod plates. Small Rig's one has 2 little holes, which is great. On my A7S, I used to have this bolted in. It has 2 bolts, and you can bolt it into the bottom of the cage, and there's no chance of it flexing. Unfortunately, the holes on the bottom of the cage don't align to this. So you're left to using a single bolt to bolt your tripod plate on, which isn't always ideal. Sometimes there's a bit of twisting in your rigs, and you kind of you find that the tripod starts to slide left to right. I'd love to have had 2 in line with each other, but these are some of the compromises. What Small Rig do offer is an Arcus Swiss style tripod plate, which can use multiple bolting points. That may work better for some. Unfortunately, my rigs all work with the Manfrotto, so I have to live with it. So one of the first things I add to my rig is a NATO rail. It would have been lovely had Small Rig included a NATO rail in it, but they said they couldn't, so we have to bolt one on. A NATO rail is useful because you can add things like NATO rail handle or other accessories to mount on the top. This is a little handle from Small Rig. I also have some from Wooden Camera. Now you can use the standard NATO rail. This is a standard safety NATO rail. You can bolt that on. As you can see, it adds a bit of height. The issue with this one is if you're going to use the XLR K2M, which slots in here, it presses up against the side of this and doesn't quite make its full contact. So this isn't really ideal. So a bit of digging, and I found Small Rig actually make a really tiny one. So it's really, really flat. Got recessed bolt points, So you can bolt it on the front and there's enough clearance. So let's add that quickly. So now you can quite easily slide on a NATO rail, tighten it up, and you've got a way of holding the camera, picking it up, carrying it. There are other NATO rail accessories that you can slide on there, which becomes quite useful. I normally leave that on the camera permanently, so it stays pretty much like that. So I use a lot of Sigma art lenses like this 18-35. They become almost my go-to lenses quite often. If you use this lens with the MC11, that gives you full autofocus, which is almost as good as native E-mount lenses. However, when I'm shooting on the Ronin, one of the small issues is if I put a rod on to the front here and I have my follow focus on, the torque of the follow focus actually starts to flex against the cage. And what happens is you get a tiny little bit of movement. You can see probably if I move my hand, you can see the tiny little bit of flex between the camera and the cage. And that's purely because we're only bolted to one thing. One of the cool things about the Metabones adapter is it's got mounting points at the bottom. And Small Rig have made a little adapter which allows you to bolt that to the bottom of your Metabones adapter and then bolts to the bottom of the cage. So that gives you two mounting points to the cage, and the cage suddenly becomes a whole lot more rigid. So let's add that. So what I've done is I've tightened these ones loosely and then mounted the screws into the bottom of the mount. That gives me the ability to get it aligned nice and tight. At the end I just lock up these two last ones onto the cage. Now if we look, you'll see that there's virtually no flex at all. So it gives you a nice solid package. The mount doesn't move at all. Now some of you might be using native E-mount lenses like the 18-105, which I quite often use when I'm traveling and I need to be really light. Then obviously you wouldn't need that. So let's have a look at some of the other things I add. So Small Rig also make rosette mounts. So that gives me the ability to use things like rosette handles or dog bones. So the next thing I'll add is a culture mount here on the side. There is one on the top, but I prefer to have one on the side to mount my wireless microphones. So while we're here, we'll put the tripod mount on. So in this configuration, it fits really easily into the bag. I can then add all the other bits and pieces as I need. So let's have a look at some of those configurations. One of the first things I can do is I can add my rosette handle to the side, which then gives me a record button on the front. Easy to work with. In this case, I'm going to actually add the dog bone first, which allows me to put the handle a bit further forward. So let's do that. Right, and we can then run the handle on the front, cable around the back. So there I've got a trigger, which is quite comfortable to hold. The next thing I'll do is just add the HDMI clamp to the side so that it's in place and connect the HDMI cable. Right, once in, I can tighten that up, but those cables are nice and secure. I can then add a top handle. Now, what becomes quite useful is I can either use a little ball joint to mount my monitor here. In some cases, I quite like to have it on the side, so somewhere around here, so that it balances the weight and what have you. To do that, I've got this little ball joint. It normally comes with a hot shoe mount, and in this case, I've taken that hot shoe mount off and put a little 50mm rod clamp. I have a little bit of movement as to where I want my monitor. Yeah, adjust to the position I want. Right, let's put a lens on. So in that configuration, I can quite easily work pulling focus and monitoring with record stop to stop. Now in some cases I'm going to be interviewing people and I might want to run multiple lav wireless microphones. So what I'll do in that case is I'll take my top handle off. I then have the Sony XLR K2M, which gives me two XLR inputs. I can slide that on, have a top mic and a radio mic, which I can then connect here. Or in this case, I'm going to take the top mic off. Now the two radio mics are using two radio mic mounts from Small Rig, a little cheese plate, and I've then modified a little cold shoe mount bolted in the bottom, and then that can slide into my cold shoe mount at the side. Both cables can run in, plug in, and I can either shoot handheld or straight on a tripod. So another configuration where this cage comes in really useful is on a gimbal. I run a DJI Ronin and I have a wireless follow focus. This one is from Motion Dogs, which is the lens hound. Now most wireless follow focuses use a 15mm rod to mount them. So this little mounting point at the front becomes really useful because you can put these little rods made by Small Rig and thread them into the front. In this case, the lens focus gear is a little bit further than the longest rod, so I'm going to mount two of them together. And there we go. I can then balance that quite easily on the Ronin. As an added little bonus, the camera just happens to be the right height when it's in the cage for the Beholder MS1. So I can use this little handheld gimbal when I need to travel light. So hopefully that's been of some use. All of the parts used in the various configurations are listed on my blog. If you check the description, there's a link to my blog, and happy shooting.